Well, thank you for that, Patrick. I don't know what to say after getting that type of introduction. All I would say is if you've been in the golf industry long enough, you get certain awards, so I'll just leave it at that. So, probably longevity awards more than anything. So, it's great to be with you, ladies and gentlemen. And so what I'd like to do, let's just get right into it. What I'd like to do with you this morning is I'm going to talk just a little bit about club benchmarking. I don't need to talk about myself because Patrick did that for me. But I want to get into the heart of the matter, which I want to share with you what we consider to be the 7 characteristics of highly effective green committees. And then we'll have time for a Q&A, then a few closing thoughts based on my experience in the golf industry. So let me tell you a little bit about club benchmarking because I'm guessing most of you probably aren't aware of the company. So we're a data analytics company that specializes in financial and operational benchmarking data for private clubs. We work with about 1,300 private clubs. I'm sure most in this room probably work with us, and we work with about 650 private club boards and general managers on areas including governance and leadership, which is the area that I specialize in. But I need to tell you the story of how this company was founded because it actually relates to a green committee. So a fellow by the name of Ray Cronin, who grew up in the Boston area, went to Harvard and MIT, was a successful tech entrepreneur. And like most successful people, he joined a private club after a while. And like most active club members, he got invited to join the Green Committee, as it turns out. So he's at his first Green Committee meeting, and 2 of the more veteran members of the committee are having what could charitably be described as a debate. Now, people of a certain age like me, do you remember the old Miller Lite commercials? Tastes great, less filling. It was one of those kind of debates. So he's watching the ping pong ball go back and forth. He finally says to one of the people, so the argument is, so one of the members is saying our budget's too high, the other member is saying the budget's too low. So he finally says to the one saying it's too low, well, how do you know? And he said, well, I don't know what our budget is. All I know is that Walpole, which is another club down the road, has a higher budget than us. So Ray thought to himself, said, we're making decisions based on 100% conjecture here. There's got to be room in this discussion for real data. And that was the genesis for the creation of the company. So it all related back to the Green Committee. And so that's what we do now. It's benchmarking information to help you as either Green Committee members or board members make better management decisions, and obviously your professional staff as well. So I'm not going to talk about myself at all because Patrick did that. You can see my high school yearbook picture here, so that's all I'll say there. But the one thing that I do want to mention through my career, spending 35 years working directly for boards of directors. So I actually had 35 different boards I worked for because they tend to change each year, at least a little bit. So during that time, I definitely saw the effects of good governance on organizations, and I definitely saw the effect of not so good governance on organizations. So when I retired from the World Golf Foundation in 2018, Ray Cronin, who I'd gotten to know through the years, asked me to come on board and head up a governance and leadership practice, which I've done since 2019. So I work primarily with, almost exclusively with private club boards and GMs on strategic planning, governance reviews, bylaws reviews, and the creation of board policy manuals. Okay, so let's get into it. So this is, again, people of a certain age will probably remember Stephen Covey and the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. This is a bit of a takeoff on that, so that's a little context for you. So let's get right into it. So the first area, you've got to define clearly the roles and responsibilities, and we really see this a lot certainly at the board level with the GM, to the extent it exists with the Green Committee and the golf course superintendent, maybe not as pronounced, but there could be some fuzziness in terms of roles and responsibilities. So what we recommend is that you very clearly delineate what are the roles specifically and the duties of the Green Committee, and what is the role and the duties specifically of the golf course superintendent. And look, I understand it can never be a perfect line. There's always going to be a little bit of gray and a little bit of overlap. But to the extent you can clearly define the two, that's critically important. And you'll see me say this often, really almost in all 7 cases, is we believe that you should create documentation that is reviewed and approved annually by the Green Committee. So why do we do that? Why do we recommend that? Well, one big reason is because green committees will change from time to time. And you could have a green committee right now that's gung-ho and says, yeah, we want to codify everything very precisely. But over time, new green committees could say, you know, that green committee from 7 years ago, they were really big into that, but we're not going to do that anymore. And a green committee could decide to do that, but if you have it codified and approved every year, it's much more difficult to do that over time. So that's why we think it's important. And for the sake of the golf course superintendent, he or she's making their living from this. This is really important to them. What are the distinctions between the two? So that's why we recommend that you put it in writing, so to speak. And this is just an example of what you could do. Now this relates to the club, and I know that's a little bit of an eye chart, but basically this is something that we use. We actually help clubs to determine this. This is an authority matrix. So it talks about the specific departments throughout the club, what the board's role is, in this case what the GM's role is, the department head, that would be the golf course superintendent in your case, and then committees, that would be you as a green committee. But it very clearly takes all the different things that happen that are of import and defines them in an authority matrix, which then is reviewed and updated on an annual basis. Now look, one of the things I'm going to say at the end, I'll just say it now, is you'll sit there over the next few minutes and say, man, this sounds pretty good, but this seems like a lot of work. It is a bit of work. I'm not going to downplay it to get it started, but it's almost like anything else. It's a little bit like pushing the boulder up the hill. Once it's a lot of work to get up the hill, but once it starts rolling down, it kind of goes on its own momentum. It's true in this case too. It's a lot of work to get it put in place, but after that, it's just a matter of maintaining it on an annual basis. We think it's worth the time and effort to do that, candidly. So that's basically what that would look like. Okay, so secondly, you would expect an organization like ours that's in the data business to promote the utilization of objective data. And again, going back to my story about how Ray Cronin formed the company, there's lots of opinions in golf, and because we all play the game, we think that we're a bit of an expert in it, and to some degree we are, we know what we like. But at the same time, if you're going to be evaluating the success of your operation and the success of your golf course superintendent, we believe you should be relying on objective data versus just how you sort of felt about how the season went. And I think in fairness to your members, in fairness to your golf course superintendent, you should look at objective data. So these are some data points. These don't have to be all of them. I'm going to give you many more here in a second. But we believe that you ought to, and this, by the way, extends to the whole club, ought to be engaging annually, or if not annually, at least every other year, in what we call a member loyalty survey. And we at Club Benchmarking do this. There's other companies that do it too. It doesn't have to be us. But let me tell you what the difference between satisfaction and loyalty is, okay? Or at least one example of it. So I know it's not always the best thing to ask an audience to start daydreaming, but I'm going to ask you to do that just to this extent. Think about your favorite restaurant, okay? Just real quick. That's not your club, okay? So it's a privately owned restaurant somewhere in your town. So just think about that. And now think about if the general manager of that restaurant called you up and said, hey, we need to do a $2 million renovation to the restaurant. You and your wife are in here once a week. I know you like the place. And we need our top 30 customers to each contribute 1/30th to the cost of the restaurant. What are you going to say to him or her? You're probably going to say no, right? I can't imagine that anyone would feel an obligation to do that, okay? Now think about yourself as a homeowner. How many of you have done renovations to your kitchen? You don't have to raise your hand, but probably most of it, or your bedroom, or your master bathroom, or whatever. So why did you do that? Well, first of all, you own the house. You want to enjoy it, maybe increase the value of the asset. But that's the difference between satisfaction and loyalty. In the case of the restaurant, you're satisfied. If you gave a satisfaction score, it'd probably be 9 or 10 consistently. So you're a satisfied customer, but you're not loyal, because when that push came to shove, you weren't there when the restaurant owner really needed you. And that's kind of a little bit of a fictitious kind of scenario, I get, but I'm just trying to make the point here between the difference. So what you want in your club is you want loyal members. You want satisfied members, but you want loyal members above all. And this metric measures loyalty, which is really what you're after. The Net Promoter Score. So as Patrick mentioned, we're in the consulting business, and Probably a lot of you have heard of Bain & Company. Maybe some of you use Bain & Company, tremendous consulting firm. So in 2003, so think about that, 20 years ago, they created what's called the Net Promoter Score, otherwise known as NPS. And basically, it's a way to help companies measure customer loyalty. And so it's very, very simple. So they ask one question, and one question only, and the question is this: on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend the XYZ country club, in this case, to a friend or family member? So it's just that one question. So if you answer the question as a consumer 9 or 10, so that's a high score, right? You're what's considered a promoter. If you answer it 7 or 8, you're considered a passive. And if you answer it 6 or lower, you're considered a detractor, okay? So the way you get the score is you take the promoters, whatever percentage of people gave you a 9 or 10 score, and then you take the detractors, and hopefully you have more promoters than detractors. You subtract from the promoter score the detractors, that gives you your score. So we've done this with 56,000 members of private clubs, just like yours, across the country. And here's where it netted out. The median score, so that's median, not average, okay? Median score is 48. The highest that we've measured is 88, which is off the charts good. The lowest, unfortunately, is minus 15. I don't know if that club's still in existence or not. That is a tough score. But just to give you a little bit of context, in the hospitality industry, which basically is travel and restaurant industry, the median score is 53. So golf clubs are just a little bit, at least in our research, are just a little bit below, 53 to 48. But you want that score in the 60s to 70s, and if you get to that level, then you're in a very solid place with your customer base. So that's the Net Promoter Score. And they're going to be hearing from Michael Lee in a minute here, but GCSAA, my former employer for 14 years, does a capital budget survey. And I know you just heard from Mike, so you got all kinds of data there, so I'm not going to go back there, but I just wanted to mention in 2022, from a capital perspective, the capital spending for 18-hole course was just under $200,000. Now, these are not New York prices, by the way, okay? So you're in another world here, really. But just think about it on scale. Capital equipment was about half of that, and the rest were other goods and products. And the top 4 projects that were undertaken, at least in 2022, at least by the people who responded to the survey, number 1 were rebuilding of bunkers, 2 was the removal of trees, 3 was drainage, and 4 was the addition of tees. And the most expensive projects that were undertaken over that period of time were new irrigation systems. Again, these are not New York prices, but the average there was $1.15 million for that. And then the new maintenance facility was the second, and that was just under $1 million. And then in terms of labor, which Mike was talking about, 63% of those polled rated their labor situation as either bad or very bad, meaning their ability to secure labor. And that was the point that Mike was making. We as a company also do a labor survey, and then this is the entire club, but we do break it down. And I'll give you that breakdown in a minute, but we have this past year, and by the way, I should have said this, but back on the Net Promoter Score, so each of you should have gotten a thumb drive, or you will get one. There's an article about the NPS in there, okay, so if you want to look at that when you get back. And then also our labor study, the executive summary, that's on your thumb drive as well. So we surveyed about 760 clubs. This is in 22 for 23. 6 regions, we broke it down. The ability to attract hourly labor, which I think amplifies Mike's point. 95% of people that responded said it was either slightly to extremely difficult to attract hourly labor. So that's just about everybody who responded. And then you heard from Mike on the increases, but you were considered in this survey part of the New England zone, so it was basically New York, New Jersey, all the way up. 20 to 30% increase in hourly wages since 2019. And that's 10 positions, but that includes golf course maintenance workers. And the average hourly wage of golf course maintenance workers was $19.41. So somewhat in line with Mike's that he shared as well. And then in terms of inflation, 89% of clubs said that inflation had the biggest impact on wages, and 60% on golf course supplies and cost of goods. So that survey is a pretty good resource for you as well. And then the other piece that I wanted to speak to that's also on your thumb drive is the Club Benchmarking Governance Survey. So this is a survey we ask all members, board members. So I assume most of you who are green chairs are probably, or green committee members. Some of you, maybe all of you are on the board, or at least some I would assume are. We had about 1,200 responses, and about 800 clubs respond to that. And there's good data in there for you as green committee members. There's data in there on capital planning, the funding of depreciation and debt service, long-term financial planning, and succession planning. And I'm going to get into that in a minute. So the reason I bring this up, and I'm going to move on here now, is because there's a lot of information out there. And look, I know that you're not, I'm speaking really to the green committee members now, you're not here to become a technical expert on agronomy, but you want to understand it well enough to do your job. But the point I'm trying to make is there's a lot of good data that will help you in that role and just in your role generally as one of the really stewards of your club by virtue of the fact that you're serving on this committee. Okay, so let's move on now. So we're big believers, as you can imagine, in key performance indicators or KPIs. So here I've listed a number of those. They're pretty self-evident, but we believe these are the sorts of things that you should be thinking about that ought to be measured on an annual basis and obviously sometimes on a monthly basis. So you can look at all of those. I think they're important to keep in mind. One of the things that we talk often about is, so you're in a seasonal area, when do you open and close your course? I asked a lot of golf course superintendents that. I asked some this morning. They basically say when the weather's good enough to open, and then on the other end when the weather's bad enough to close. But I think you should track that. You should track on an annual basis when's the golf course opening and when's it closing, how many days is it open, how many rounds are you playing in those days. I'm going to talk about communication in a minute. I think that's an important part of it that ought to be considered. So there's some KPIs to consider. And so what we like to say is that whatever you decide are your KPIs, you should determine how often are you going to measure those. And then whatever you decide to measure be included in a KPI document that you review and approve annually. So I'm guessing virtually all of the Green Committee members either are in business right now, whether you own it yourself or you're in part of a big company, or you were in business. You probably, in your own business, you measured it somehow. Whatever the measures were. Obviously sales would probably be at the top of the list, but there are other metrics you paid attention to. The same thing exists with golf courses, just figuring out what those are, what matters to you, what's most important, and then measure those on an annual basis. And I can say, speaking on behalf of the golf course superintendents in the room, that they would find favor with that. That would be something that they would like to make sure that you're measuring the things that matter most. So that's the main point here on KPIs. Okay, so let's move into communication, and candidly, so we, as I mentioned, we consult with about 650 clubs, and that's not at any one given time, obviously, but it's a good number of clubs. Those are all private clubs, by the way. And this is the one area, there's really two main areas that are probably the weakest, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but it really is a great opportunity. So what we promote is the idea of figuring out who is it that you want to communicate with and need to communicate with, one, and that isn't that hard of an exercise to figure out. And then what do you want to communicate, and how often do you want to communicate that, and then what kind of vehicles do you want to use to communicate it. So just figuring out, so let me give you a couple, or just one example. So remember I talked about just a second ago, the idea of keeping track as to when the golf course opened, when it closed, how many days it was open. I would think as a member, and I am a member of a private club, that would be an interesting stat to get at the end of the year to say, look, the golf course opened this year, I'm making all this up, on April 3rd, and it closed on November 5th. And during that time we were closed on Mondays, if you are, so those days automatically come out. And because of weather, we were closed 15 other days. So we were open, whatever, do the math, 137 days. I'm making all this up, obviously. And during that time, we played, whatever, 20,000 rounds of golf for an average, do the math, that type of thing. That would just be an interesting stat. Now, so why do you share that? Well, you're just trying to engage the membership in what's going on the golf course. And in some cases, you can help to blunt perception, particularly if you have historical data. So you can go on to say, over the last 40 years, the numbers in 2023 were 5% higher than we've ever had in terms of days open, and play was 7% higher. And if someone's walking around saying, you know what, it seemed like the golf course was closed more this year for whatever reason, and it seemed like we didn't play as many rounds of golf, and there's all sorts, believe me, in any kind of environment like this, these urban legends that get started, and then they become sort of mythology, right? And all of a sudden, everybody close saying, oh man, the club was closed. We didn't play as much golf this year, but yet you played more. So that's why it's important to track this data. It's not really difficult to do once you've decided to do it. So that's the point there. So just figuring out what the groups are that you want to communicate, what you want to communicate, how you want to do, and how often you want to do is critically important in our direction. Okay? Communication. So let me tell you something. So I spent 14 years working for the GCSAA, so the Golf Course Superintendents Association of America. Loved every minute of it. I can tell you, and I don't probably need to, I'm talking to the Green Committee members now, golf course superintendents are among the hardest working, most loyal people that I've come across. And they love accountability. They really do. I learned that almost from the first day that I joined the organization. So they want to be held accountable. And that's a rare gift in today's time because not a lot of people like to be. So to the extent you as a Green Committee, you'll want to hold your golf course superintendent accountable at some level for performance. So these are some ideas that you can think of that would be areas that you and the golf course superintendent want to be in sync on. So things like height of cut and everything that's associated with that. Those are a few of the areas that you could speak to with the fairways, for example. So placement of tee markers and rotation of hole locations. I'm sure you try to keep your golf course at generally the same length day in and day out, so you move the tees and the holes proportionate to that. But you have, like you're having right now or had yesterday, if you have a nor'easter for 4 or 5 days, try to do some things with your tee locations on the holes where you're playing into a north wind, or if you have, like California, it's called the Pineapple Express. If you got wind coming out of the south, maybe it's different, but you get the idea. But those are all things that you can quantify and say, look, I'm making this up, we want the golf course day in and day out from the regular tees to play at 6,400 yards. And so then the golf course superintendent and the Green Committee determine, well, how are we going to do that? So day in and day out, the golf course is going to play at that length. So those are ways to do it. The other piece has to do with the golf course superintendent's crew. And I'll come back to this in a minute, but I've got some thoughts on that I think you can consider. But one of the things is, so what hours is the golf course superintendent's crew going to be on the golf course? I think it's important to understand that, and here's why. And then secondly, I'll get into here's why in a second, what's the policy when golfers are on the course? Now I can tell you, I don't usually play much in the early mornings, but when I do, I can tell you just about every golf course I've been to over the last decade or two, the golf course maintenance workers are well trained, because if we're playing and we come up, they stop what they're doing, they physically get out of the way, watch us finish out the hole, usually on the putting green, and then they resume with whatever they're doing, blowing, weeding, whatever the chore is. But you should quantify that. And so the golf course superintendent would say, hey, look, we're going to be on the golf course in the summer between 5 a.m. and 10 a.m. Again, I'm making this up. And why would you do this? Well, here's why. Because what about communicating that to golfers? To say, look, if you're playing the golf course superintendent's crew is going to be on the golf course from the first tee times, let's say 7 o'clock or whatever, again, making this up. So between 7 a.m. and 10 a.m., you are going to see golf course maintenance workers on the course, and they're going to be doing their jobs. And by the way, when they're on the course, this is what they're trained to do. They will get out of the way, they will cut off their equipment, whatever it is. But just important to have those clarified. So that, again, going back to the mythology, I was playing around in golf, and man, there seemed like there was a golf course maintenance worker on every hole, and and I'm lining up my putt, and off goes a weed eater. And you can say, well, that couldn't be true, because one thing, they're only on a golf course till 10 in the morning, and secondly, they're trained to turn things off when a golfer attempted a shot or lining up a shot, whatever the case might be. But those are little things that are important, though, to manage expectations. And then, of course, standards for your major events. You're probably going to set up the golf course, and it's going to be groomed to a different level for club championships, member guests, etc. How about housekeeping? So what's the policy? How often is the trash removed from at the team grounds? Does a member of the golf course superintendent's crew get on the golf course during the day and kind of pick up the broken tees on par threes? Do they get onto the tee boxes on par threes and replace divots or put divot mix there? How often are the ball washers refilled? All those things are important. And again, they do two things. One, it's a contract basically, not a literal one. It's an agreement between the golf course superintendent and the green committee, and ultimately the board, and ultimately the members, on how this golf course is going to be presented day in and day out. And two, for the golf course superintendent, it gives him the scorecard. So we expect, whatever the expectation is, we expect trash to be removed, I'm just making this up, twice a day, or whatever the case might be, and someone on, taking the broken tees and putting dip mix twice a day, whatever it is. But those sorts of things should be specified. And then the age-old debate about bunkers: do you keep brakes in? Are they out? Is the handle out? Do golf course superintendent staff members go around the golf course during the day and put them back in the right place, whatever your policy is as a club? So just specifying those things, and there's dozens more. You have a number of golf course superintendents in the room. They know much more than I do about what these things are. But these are all things that have to happen. And see, what you should be doing as green committee members is telling your superintendent what matters most. You're representing your members who are not in that green committee room. And you should be saying, these are the sorts of things that matter most to us as club members. This is what we want the focus to be on. They can't do everything, but if you tell them what matters most, then they'll produce those. Trust me, they'll produce what you want. I can assure you of that. Okay, so this is just about bunkers, what type of sand, how much. Are you going to use Sand Pro, hand rake, or both? So those are just standards of maintenance. Okay, I actually thought about this last night. I became executive director of the Georgia State Golf Association, so you're the equivalent of the Met in Georgia, in 1983. So that's 40 years ago. And one of the first groups I ever spoke in front of was the Georgia Golf Course Superintendents Association late that year. So it's almost 40 years later. And I'm going to say it again, I'll say what I said 40 years ago. So I believe that the golf course superintendent's crew, and maybe yours do, okay, but I believe they should have uniforms that are supplied by the club, to include hats. And here's why. So just think about this for a second. So you're a member and you have a guest, and so you walk into the pro shop, right? And so the head golf professional and his or her staff, they look like they're out of a Peter Millar catalog, right? They're very well, and they should be. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. Then you run into the general manager walking down the hall to go get a bite to eat, and he and his, or she, and his or her staff, they look like they're out of a Brooks Brothers catalog, right? So, but then you get down the golf course, and you have the golf course not the golf course superintendent, who would be well attired, but you have members of his or her crew that sort of look like, and I don't mean this in a negative way at all, but they sort of look like they were pulled off the day laborer line, So the question is, should they be projecting a similar image to you and your member and your guest as the rest of your professional staff? So that's my belief. That's one man's opinion. But look, you've got a certain culture that you have at your club. You have a brand, whether you know it or not, at your club. And everything that happens, every interaction contributes or detracts from that. And so I'm saying have the golf course superintendent, not him or her as an individual, but have their crews contribute to that overall culture that you want. And then this piece is important too. We talked about this is more on a daily basis. What time is the golf course going to open? What time is it going to close? Some people say, hey, we stay open until the last golfer leaves. That's great if that's your philosophy. But have a philosophy and make sure the members are aware of that as well. So those are a few examples of things. So again, and then the other piece that I would mention here are green committee meetings. We think meetings are very important. Sometimes they get a little bit of short shrift, but we think determining, so what's going to be on the agenda, who's going to get the agendas out, who's going to take the minutes, who's going to distribute those, what about the follow-up items from the meetings, all that should be documented. And then, very importantly, the golf course superintendent's performance evaluation should be well documented. It should be very clear, both from the green committee chair and the golf course superintendent perspective. What's that look like? I mean, what does the physical evaluation look like? Who's going to be involved with it? What kind of feedback is going to be solicited? And I understand in a lot of clubs there's a GM involved too, there's a board involved, but usually the green committee has a role in that. So we think that that's critically important as well. Okay, so the other piece that I wanted to speak to where we see clubs not do as well has to do with continuous learning. And so here's basically the way to look at it. If you view, starting with your board, if you view your board as a strategic asset of the club, we think the board is the most important strategic asset. I'm not talking about a physical asset now, but a strategic asset, a non-physical one. Then if you accept that premise, then you would also logically assume that the green committee would also be a key strategic asset of the club as well. So think about your assets. You know, Mike just talked about budgets and whatnot, and I talked about it a little bit. You invest heavily, obviously, in your assets, in your golf course, the people to maintain it, etc. But do you invest in your green committee as well, as a unit, as a body? And just think about this. So you become chair of the green committee. That requires you to chair meetings. It probably requires you to write something for the newsletter. It probably requires you maybe to give a speech at your annual meeting of members, whatever you might be asked to do. You might have been in a business where you never gave a speech in your life. You never wrote an article. You never chaired a meeting. But now you're in this position and you're magically expected to do that, like what, by osmosis? So we say people like that, if you're in these key roles, should get, if you need it, should get training in that regard as well. So thinking about the committee as a strategic asset will really change the mindset around the fact that we think education should be a big part. You should be getting, you know the old saying, the status quo is backing up. So we think green committees should be getting better over time. You should be working at getting better, getting more knowledgeable. And again, your golf course superintendent can help with that in terms of what are good sources of information and education. Okay, and then succession planning. I said a little bit earlier that I would talk about this. So this is another area that tends to be a little slapdash. So we think that succession planning should be orderly and should be strategic and should be thoughtful. And so basically, and I understand in some clubs it's just there's a new president and then he or she gets to select the committee chairs and then the committee chairs select the committees. But I'll tell you, in some clubs that we consult with, first of all, some clubs have moved away from nominating committees to what's called leadership development committees. And whereas nominating committees tend to be episodic, so they come into kind of action for a short period of time, maybe a month or two. They come up with the nominees and they go away. A leadership development committee it's evergreen. It works all year round, trying to identify and nurture people who can become, potentially anyway, future board members, future committee members, including green committee members. We think even if your club doesn't engage in that, you can do that. You can help to identify and help to nurture future green committee members. We think it's that important because, again, you are ultimately helping to influence your top asset at the club, as we'll talk about in just a second, and as Mike mentioned as well. And then the other piece, too, I realize with a golf course superintendent, you typically have an assistant superintendent, but thinking about, and the assistant may or may not be there for a long period of time, although now they're tending maybe to stay a little bit longer, maybe not in this environment, but succession planning for your golf course superintendent is important too, particularly if you have a superintendent that's coming toward the end of his career or her, figuring out, now you may just decide, well, we're going to go out to the marketplace, we're going to hire a search firm, and that's how we're going to do it. That's fine, but think about your companies, particularly those of you that work for big companies. most big companies, at least the well-run ones, tend to try to hire from within. Well, why wouldn't you do that at your golf course? But if you don't ever think about it, then how's that going to happen? Again, it'll be a little bit accidental. Okay, so just a few closing thoughts here as we move on and adjourn. So this isn't the grammar and the syntax here isn't proper, but I do it for a reason. So in all my years, in all the different roles I've had in golf, and now the last 5 years where I've been consulting directly with clubs, it's true, I've never met a club, what I would consider to be a good club, that was bad at governance. Those two just don't go together. So thinking about governance as part of your stewarding of the club, which I'm sure you think about that, is important. And look, as I said at the outset, it does take some effort, particularly to get this started. But once you do get it in place, it becomes just part of how you do business as a club. Mike said this, you'll probably hear it a couple more times this morning, no question that the golf course is the #1 driver of satisfaction and loyalty, candidly, for most members of your club. Although, what we've seen through our data is it's not all about the golf. Now, some of you may just be at a golf club, so there it is all about the golf. But those of you that are at a country club with a lot of different amenities, it used to be, it was just about dad being happy with the golf, and that was sort of all you needed to do. But that's not the way it is anymore. Mom's got to be happy, the kids have to be happy, etc. So, but still, golf is by far and away the #1 driver of satisfaction, and that's what you're stewarding as Green Committee members. And Mike talked about this, and I don't need to tell you this, but you've got high inflation, you've got a really tight labor market, particularly here. But to the extent possible, keep investing in that asset, which has been proven to be the top asset. So let me give you a couple thoughts that are not on the screen here. So as Patrick mentioned, I've been in the golf industry for 43 years, so I've seen a lot of things kind of come and go. But one thing that I'm really excited about, and I think this will ultimately have a positive impact on you down the road, is there's a different group of people coming into the game now, and they're getting introduced to the game in a different way. So most people, if you think back on how you got introduced to the game, so in my case, and probably most of you, my dad introduced me to the game when I was 12 years old. And I loved it, and I became, it ended up being my career. That doesn't happen to a lot of people, but that's how it happened for me. Probably most of you would say something similar. But it's not the way it's happened. It is a way, but now people are getting introduced to the game through Topgolf or PopStroke or simulators that have lounges. And that's a great thing. So the demographics are going to change, and how people enter the game is going to change over time. So keep that in mind. That's point one. Point two is if you're not, as a club, thinking about, talking about, and figuring out how it relates to you around DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion, I would ask you to consider starting right away, because it is part of every inch of society, basically. And if you're in business, you know that to be true, particularly if you're at a bigger company. So just think about it in your own club's context. So think about it from a membership perspective, from the leadership of your club, who are on your committees, and in a staff perspective. That's one area where the golf course superintendent staff tends to be fairly diverse. But think about that. And then thirdly and finally, just think about the general level of expectation in our society today. So despite everything we've heard, it's still extremely high. So people have a sense of immediate gratification. They want everything right now, no questions asked. They want all the costs wrung out of all the processes within a business, so they want you to be super efficient, no extraneous cost, and past that, reduce cost to the customer. But there is a silver lining for golf courses, and we all, people who participate in this kind of frenzied world, we want a refuge, we want a sanctuary that takes us away from all that, all the noise and the stress and the clutter. The golf course is the perfect sanctuary for that. So understanding that need that you're fulfilling for people is really important, particularly as people who are running green committees. So I'm going to stop there. I think I've successfully busted through the Q&A time. But I too, like Mike, I'll be here the rest of the morning and through lunch, and be happy to talk with any of you as you deem appropriate. There's my contact information if you want to contact me. Love to talk to you. Love the game, just want to contribute. I congratulate you on all the good work that you're doing. I'll turn it back to Patrick. Thank you very much.